Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. The topic that we are going to cover today is on the internal control. This is the auditing course, the first auditing course for the degree program. In this video, I'm going to cover only the definition and the fundamental concept. The other subtopics will be covered in the second internal control system video. What is internal control? According to the International Standards on Auditing, ISA 315, internal control is actually a process which is designed and implemented and maintained by those charged with governance, management, and other personnel to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of an entity's objective with regard to the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Okay, the definition here, it can be divided into 4 parts. First is actually about the process design, the implementation, and the maintenance. And then the second part here, you can see that it is being done by those who are charged with governance. And these are the management and other top personnel within the organization. And the purpose is actually to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of the entity's objective. So the third part, we can say that importantly, the internal control is actually to provide reasonable assurance. But reasonable assurance of what? It's actually about the entity's objective achievement with regard to the reliability of the financial reporting, and also about the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization's operation. And lastly is actually to provide reasonable assurance with regard to the compliance with applicable laws and regulations. The term controls refer to any aspect of one or more control components. COSO also provides a definition for internal control, and is actually a process carried out by the board of directors, the administration, and other personnel of an entity designed to provide reasonable security with respect to the achievement of objectives in the following categories: the effectiveness and efficiency of the operations, the reliability of financial reports, and the compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So you can see that this definition of COSO is also similar to the ISA 315. Okay, for a simple understanding about the definition, you can see here that internal controls are actually processes, policies, and procedures that include rules and regulations implemented by management of the company. And these are mainly to achieve the company's objective. Before we go into detail, let's look at the objectives of the internal controls. Okay, we see here that it is actually to ensure that business operations are carried out smoothly, efficiently, and effectively. Also, the purpose of the internal control is to safeguard the assets, to comply with rules and regulations, to ensure that the records are properly kept, secret information are kept confidential, as well as to maximize profit and minimize costs. So you can see here that the characteristic of the internal controls are actually is about the processes, about the policies, and about the procedures that are implemented by the management of the company. And the main purpose or objective is actually to achieve the company's objectives and goals. Another characteristic of internal control is that it is actually the responsibility of the management. So here the management has to design appropriate and adequate internal controls and to implement them so that it can provide reasonable assurance that the company will achieve its objective. So the management must maintain company's internal control, and to maintain, the company must review the adequacy of the internal controls regularly. Okay, we see here in red print reasonable assurance. But what does it mean by reasonable assurance? It's actually unwilling to implement internal control system that is ideal or cost too high to the company. So the company or the management will only implement internal controls that are only appropriate and adequate to meet the objective of the company. Okay, internal controls have 5 components according to COSO framework. And the 5 components are the control environments, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Okay, what is the control environment? The control environment is actually the overall environment of the company. It forms the umbrella for the other 4 internal control components. The control environment is actually about the overall policies and procedures implemented at the top level, and this control environment reflects the attitude of the top management or the directors or the honest equity who are the part of the management about the internal controls and its importance to the company. So the control environment relates to the integrity and the ethical values of the top management that set the company's ethical and behavioral standard. The next component is risk assessment and management. Okay, risk assessment or risk management here. This is actually when the company or the management has to perform risk assessment on certain critical areas in order to ensure that the company achieves its objective or goals. So the risk assessment can be carried out on the information technology, on the personnel, on the work environment, customers and suppliers. Yeah? And also recently we have this pandemic like COVID-19. Then the management must also carry out risk assessment on the effect of the pandemic COVID-19 on the business operation. So the purpose of risk assessment is actually for the management to identify, as I said just now, the high risk areas so that the appropriate internal controls can be considered to manage this risk, and also to ensure that the company can reduce the risk of making losses. Okay, control activities. This is the third element of the control component. Okay, it's about the actions that are necessary to be taken by the management to address risks that can affect the company achieving its objectives. And altogether, there are 5 specific control activities, or we say here 5 control actions. The first one is the separation of duties. Second is the authorization of transaction and activities. The third one is documents and records. And the fourth is physical control over asset and records. Lastly, independent checks on performance. Let's look at what this refers to. Okay, control activities that relates to the adequate separation of duties. Right, in this particular situation is where the organization or the management has to ensure that there are certain duties that have to be separated in a way that uh, not one or single personnel will carry a few responsibilities. This is to make sure that the business operation can be carried out very smoothly, efficiently, and effectively, and there is no foul play within the organization. So importantly, the areas that need to be segregated are the authorization, the custody, the recording or accounting, and the operational responsibilities. For example, like there has to be a separation between the function of uh, the custody of the asset from the accounting function, or the separation of the authorization from the custody of the asset, the separation of the operational responsibility from the record keeping responsibility or the accounting responsibility, and also it can be separating the duty between those who have the IT duties from the user department. Okay, in relation to the adequate document and records, which form part of the control activity, the company or the management has to make sure that the documents are properly kept, properly organized, so that there will be no missing document. Also to ensure that there is no manipulation of documents, also to make sure that the documents or the confidential documents fall into the hands of those who are not entitled to this document. Also, with regard to this adequate documents and record, the documents and records have to be properly numbered, pre-numbered consecutively to make sure that they are organized in a manner which where there are missing documents, it can be immediately identified, and to prepare the transaction or to prepare the documents within a reasonable time, preferably immediately after a transaction has taken place. And there are also a requirement where certain documents and records have to be designed for multiple purposes, multiple uses, and this is actually to minimize the number of different forms. And the documents also has to be designed to meet certain purpose. The next control activity is physical control of assets and record. These are very important to the company because if they are not protected, then they can be destroyed. For example, like asset can be stolen or can be damaged, while records, they can be manipulated or even can be destroyed. So there must be adequate policy, adequate procedure, internal control policy and procedure to protect these assets and record. For example, like asset, in order to safeguard the asset, it has to be protected in a way that, for example, to have the fire detector if it's a warehouse, to have alarm, to have the strict access to the warehouse, and even to have the appropriate room temperature. For instance, the asset which is require certain temperature level. And for the records, it can be physical control, like to have that a backup, to have in soft copy or hard copy form, to make sure that there are password to get access to these documents or records, and also to make sure that if let's say the information are in the computer system, there must be firewalls or antivirus software to prevent the records or documents from being hacked. The last control activity is independent checks on performance. This is about the staff work performance. The management has to make sure that there are rules and regulations to monitor the work performance. This is to make sure that the staff are functioning according to the rules and the regulations and are also comply with the rules and regulations. For instance, at the moment we have this change to our business environment due to pandemic COVID-19, where everybody has to be locked down. So the company may be affected seriously because of this new situation, and therefore they have to come up with new rules and regulations. So therefore, it's actually very important for the company to perform these checks on performance. Okay, also in a regular situation, there might be circumstances where the personnel might be forgetful, might be careless, or ignore to follow the procedure. So by having these independence checks on performance, then the staff or the personnel might be alert to these rules and regulations and try to reduce about getting forgetful or careless. Information and communication is the fourth control component. In all organizations, there will be a lot of information involved. So to make sure that the company generate useful, credible, reliable information, then from the very beginning, this information or the transaction have to be protected. Um, it has to be recorded timely. The information or the transaction have to be recorded completely and accurately, and also there must be policies and procedure to avoid duplication of recording, because if there is duplication of recording, then the information, the financial statement may no longer be accurate and valid. Also, there might be certain information that are confidential, so the policies and procedure have to be in place to ensure this confidentiality. Uh, most in most situations now, the company generate information using the information technology, so they must have backup to make sure that there will be no loss of the information. Okay, this information are going to be useful only if they are being communicated. So the company must make sure that only those who deserve the information are being communicated. Otherwise, confidential information might land into wrong hands, and this can affect the competitiveness of the organization. The last control component is monitoring. This is actually the overall monitoring of the internal control policies and procedures as well as the processes. We know that in organization there will be a lot of business activities, business operations, and each of these activity and operation will have its own policies and procedure. So the organization has to constantly monitor these rules, procedures, processes to make sure they are still running efficiently and effectively in achieving the overall objective of the company. We know that over time there will be changes to the business environment. So if there is no monitoring, then the company might be may no longer be able to sustain in the market, and they may be no longer competitive, and that's why it's very important to ensure that all rules, regulations, policies, procedures are running accordingly. Limitations of internal control. Before we go into detail about this, let's recall about the definition of the internal control. We know that it's about the processes, the policies, the procedures implemented by the management to ensure that the company achieve the goal. However, okay, there might be circumstances where management themselves override these rules and regulations, maybe due to their personal interests, which actually go against the interests of the organization. Or it could be a situation where the company uh, a situation where the management has to make fast decision which they themselves overrule the rules and the regulation. Okay, the next limitation is relating to the lack of funds. Okay, company that is small in size, has less capital, they may not be able to implement appropriate and adequate internal controls. Okay, the next limitation is about collusion. If you remember, we talk about the control activity that relates to separation of duties. This is to make sure that there is no fraud occurring within the organization. But if let's say there are two people from two different functions come together to commit fraud, then how even how strong the internal controls are, still it can be challenged. Okay, the next one is the limitation that relates to the cost and benefit. Well, we know that the management will only implement internal controls if the benefit is more as compared to the cost that they are going to incur. So how good the internal controls would be, but if let's say the cost is too high, the management might not implement it. Okay, breakdown is another limitation. How good the internal controls are, if let's say the internal controls break down, then it can no longer function effectively and efficiently. For example, like due to blackout, due to natural hazard, earthquake, flooding, and the fire that occurred at the company, perhaps warehouse. That's the first part of the internal control. Well, I just wanted to share with you. This is actually taken in Shanghai, 2009, and this is actually the first train in Shanghai. Thank you for listening.